Introduction to Running the Blockade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Introduction. A German admiral has remarked that the most valuable naval history lies in the dispatches and logs of naval officers. Our own Naval Record Society, by the line it has taken, thoroughly endorses this view, and has committed itself to the teaching of naval history from the mouths of the men who made it. Mr. Taylor's work, then, must not be taken as a mere record of personal adventure, however absorbing it be found from this point of view. As a picture of exciting escapes, of coolness and resource at moments of acute danger, of well calculated risks, boldly accepted and obstinately carried through, it has few rivals in recent sea history. But its deeper value does not lie here. Over and above its romantic interest, it will be recognized by students of the naval art as a real and solid contribution to history, for it presents to us from the pen of a principal actor the most complete account we have of a great blockade in the days of steam. The important part that blockade plays in naval warfare is a thing hardly recognized outside professional ranks. For the general reader, the grand manoeuvres of a great fleet in chase of the enemy and the stirring hours of some decisive action throw into oblivion the tedious months of dull, anxious, and exhausting work with which by far the greater part of the war is taken up. Yet it is hardly too much to say that during the most glorious period of our maritime history 9/10 of the energies of our admirals were devoted to blockade. In the future it is possible that it will take even a higher place. Should England become engaged with a first-rate foreign power, single-handed, it is a recognized fact among naval strategists that in a week she could close every one of her enemy's ports and have a fleet free to reduce at its leisure everything he held beyond the seas. With almost any two powers against her it is probable she could do as much, and it is the recognition of this power abroad which gives England, in spite of her military weakness, so commanding a position in Europe. The importance, then, of studying every scrap of information on the subject in order to perfect our knowledge of the art of blockade cannot be exaggerated, and Mr. Taylor's simple and straightforward record of his experiences may claim to be perhaps the fullest contribution to the subject that as yet exists. Experiences of individual captains we have had, and read with the present work they are of high value, but Mr. Taylor has something more to tell. Not only did he run the blockade personally a greater number of times than any one else, but, boy as he was at the time, he was the chief organizer of a great and systematized attack on the Northern blockade, such as the world has never seen before. His operations may be said to have opened a new era in the history of blockade, and one which bids fair to have far-reaching consequences for every maritime power. To make clear his position and its dangers and difficulties, a word must be said on the general subject of blockade. Blockade, it must be clearly borne in mind, is of two kinds, the one military, the other commercial. The first concerns the belligerents alone, and consists in one of them, who has obtained a working command of the sea, imprisoning the other's war fleets in their own ports. It was this form of blockade which absorbed by far the greatest part of our naval activity during the great French wars. During the American Civil War it was considerably practiced, and from American sources may be studied in complete detail the efforts of the Confederate warships to escape the vigilance of Federal blockading squadrons. The second form, or commercial blockade, is one that principally concerns neutrals, and it was of course to this form alone that Mr. Taylor's operations extended. The international law which regulates its conditions as between neutrals and belligerents is shortly this. A belligerent, if strong enough at sea to close one or more ports of his enemy, may give notice to neutral powers that such port or ports are blockaded, and thereafter if any neutral vessel attempts to enter or leave them, the belligerent may treat it as an enemy, and may destroy or capture and condemn it as an ordinary prize. To run a blockade, then, is an operation attended with all the risks of war. Indeed, a blockade runner is in an even worse position than a hostile belligerent, for not being a combatant he may not resist the efforts of the blockaders to destroy or capture him. He is entitled to escape if he can, but a single shot or blow in his own defense makes him a pirate, and a belligerent capturing him may treat him as such. But it must always be remembered that for a belligerent to be entitled to exercise these high prerogatives he must first have constituted a real and effective blockade. A mere declaration that a port is closed is not enough. It must be so closely watched and invested with an adequate naval force that no neutral can leave or enter without running present danger of being sunk or captured. Analogous to the rights arising out of an effective blockade, and always to be clearly distinguished from them, is the right of a belligerent to treat as an enemy a neutral vessel carrying contraband of war to his enemy's ports, and this right he may always exercise, whether the ports in question be effectively blockaded or not. It was this consideration, no doubt, combined with a desire to preserve a strict neutrality, and to see the South treated as belligerents and not as mere insurgents, that induced the English government to recognize the Federal blockade as soon as it was declared. At the opening of the war the Federal government, in defiance of international law, declared the whole southern seaboard under blockade. It was a blockade they were then wholly unable to enforce, or even to pretend to enforce, but as most of our blockade runners carried contraband of war, there was very little to be gained by disputing the Federal pretensions. Some injustice, no doubt, was thus done to the South, but it was more than counterbalanced by the advantage they gained in that the recognition of the blockade made them indisputably belligerents. For these reasons our government thought it wise to waive its neutral rights and submit to a paper blockade, which did not exist. As the Northern power increased at sea, the blockade became more and more effective, and by the time Mr. Taylor had got fully to work it may be said to have been something more than a pretense. Finally it became very strict and thoroughly effective, and it is with this instructive period that his reminiscences are chiefly concerned. This declaration of blockade that could not be enforced at the time was not the only extension of belligerent rights which the Federal government claimed and exercised in respect of blockade. As Mr. Taylor fully explains, they did not confine their operations against blockade runners to the established practice of watching the closed ports. Not only did they cruise for offenders on the high seas, but they intercepted them close to the points of departure, thousands of miles from the blockaded ports. Nay, they even went so far as to attempt to blockade the neutral ports which the offending vessels were using as bases of operations. To most of these claims no objection was made, and there is no doubt that in any future war similar operations will be recognized without question, as within belligerent rights. In previous wars, a belligerent declaring a blockade had to concern himself with little more than turning back ordinary merchantmen who had not received notice of the blockade, or cutting off small fry of the smuggling type that slipped over from adjacent coasts to take their chance of getting in. Such a thing as neutral merchants establishing public companies to build fleets of specially designed vessels for the avowed purpose of breaking a blockade which was thoroughly effective against ordinary types of merchantmen, was a thing unknown to international law. And further, when these merchants stretched their rights as neutrals, so far as to establish regular bases almost in the enemy's waters, from which to conduct their revolutionary operations, it was obvious that some latitude must be granted to the blockading power. No objection, therefore, was ever raised to his cutting off vessels avowedly constructed for blockade running at any point he chose, but when he attempted to blockade neutral ports from which they were acting, England put her foot down and compelled the Federal cruisers to draw off. In this she was clearly within her rights. But although the Federal claim to this bold extension of belligerent rights was undoubtedly illegal, it was not without provocation. It is another law of blockade that a vessel is not guilty and cannot be interfered with unless it is bound for a blockaded port. The system pursued by Mr. Taylor of establishing depots or bases on British territory close to American waters thus greatly increased the difficulties of the cruisers. Goods destined for the blockaded ports were consigned first to one of these bases, Bermuda, Havana, or the Bahamas, and on their way could not be touched by the Northern captains. It was naturally a great temptation to these officers, as they watched the offensive traffic pouring into the runners' bases, to see that it did not get out. It is even conceivable that England might have been induced to wink at their proceedings. But it so happened that the first and only attempt to blockade runners in a British port was made by the very officer who was the culprit in the Trent affair, and that, too, while we were still unsoothed from his last violation of our neutrality. The British government, therefore, happened to be in a very irritable mood with the North, and though they had hitherto been inexhaustible in their sympathy with the Federal belligerent pretensions, they now peremptorily stopped their complacency, and the North had to submit. Whether the claim made tentatively by the Northern government is destined to become recognized by international law is by no means clear. In the case in question the neutral was too powerful to be resisted. Shortly after, however, the same scheme was actually put in operation by one of the most famous of Mr. Taylor's colleagues, the notorious Captain Roberts, the arch blockade runner and a British naval officer. When the American war closed, the Turkish government had been trying for months to suppress an insurrection in Crete by blockading the island on the old lines. Hobart, whose nom de guerre as a blockade runner was Roberts, profiting by his recent experience, undertook to suppress it in a week, and his offer was accepted. The insurgents were living entirely on supplies sent them from Greece, and Hobart, having been placed in command of the blockading squadron, proceeded at once to blockade the Greek vessels in their own ports, and the Cretans were immediately starved into surrender. This and every other indication show a tendency for the belligerent rights of blockade to increase at the expense of the neutral. If this be so, then blockade must become a more and more effective naval operation, and hence the importance of its study down to the minutest particulars from which any forecast of the future may be obtained. For the non-professional reader, one of the chief points of technical interest in Mr. Taylor's book will be the light it throws on a great national question, which periodically comes out in moments of alarm. It is now a common subject for paragraphists to dilate upon how, if England lost command of the sea, her food supply would be cut off in a week, or some other minute period, and herself be brought to the mercy of her enemy. However useful such prognostications may be for stimulating an interest in the Navy, they are full of fallacies, and even dangerous, as leading to demands for naval armaments so extravagant as to cause the taxpayer to turn his back on the Navy altogether, and button his pockets in sheer disgust. To begin with, if England lost the command of the sea, it does not follow that any one else would obtain it, a fact too often lost sight of in naval discussion. The thing does not hang in a simple dilemma. You cannot say, either England has the command or her enemy has it. There is still the middle hypothesis, that neither has it. And this in all reasonable probability is the worst that could suddenly befall us. The destruction of England's command of the sea is no child's play, and even if three powers together succeeded in doing it, it could only be at such a sacrifice to themselves as would leave the seas practically free to the operations of neutrals. Mr. Taylor's experiences show clearly how surprisingly easy it was for bold and expert captains with adequate vessels to run the most strict and effective blockades. Were England to become engaged in a great war, the first step would be for numbers of her mercantile marine to pass to neutral flags, and all these vessels with their crews would be ready-made blockade runners the moment there was a call for them. And even assuming that by some extraordinary chance the British fleet for a time was suppressed with little or no damage to the enemy, the precedents of the American war go to show that the navies of three powers, absolutely intact, could hardly avail to maintain a blockade of such a coastline as ours. The conditions of blockade, it is true, have changed, but the balance remains much the same. Mr. Taylor considers that searchlights, for instance, tell quite as much for one side as the other. Increased speed is at least as favorable for running as it is for blockading. Torpedo boats seem hardly to affect the balance at all, for while they render the position of a blockading squadron less secure than formerly, they on the other hand furnish it with ideal patrols. Quick-firing guns are all in favor of the blockader, but on the other hand long-range guns of position are all against him, compelling him to keep further to sea, and so to cover more ground. The extreme importance of invisibility, too, on which Mr. Taylor insists, shows how great an advantage a runner, able to procure good smokeless coal, would have over a force blockading the English coast which could not obtain it. On the whole, we may safely conclude that a commercial blockade is certainly no easier than it was in the 60's. Many indications from the following pages show how difficult it is to maintain the blockade even of half a dozen ports, if you are unable to intercept the regular runners at their points of departure. This a force without undisputed mastery of the sea could never effect to a sufficient extent. The lesson, then, that the following pages most clearly teaches is, that the danger of the British Isles being blockaded by any conceivable combination of hostile powers, so as to reduce her even approximately near starvation, may be dismissed as outside the region of practical strategy. And in the next place they show us the vast importance of maintaining in our navy an adequate force of vessels of a type calculated to render a commercial blockade really effective. What Mr. Taylor was able to do with one little steamer to prolong Lee's resistance is a lesson to be remembered besides Dundonald's operations on the coast of Spain. Such are a few of the considerations which Mr. Taylor's book suggests. Different men will draw different lessons from the facts it presents, but its value as the work of a man of unequalled experience in the working of a great blockade will be admitted by all. And whatever weight may be attached to the author's conclusions from his practical experience, the little work will amply justify its existence if it in any way stimulates interest in the practical side of a subject which naval writers seem inclined to leave too much in the hands of international lawyers. Julian Corbett, May, 1896. End of introduction. Chapter 1 of Running the Blockade by Thomas E. Taylor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. How I Began. Feeling in Liverpool. Declaration of Blockade. Its immediate result. Effect on trade in Liverpool. The theory of blockades. Attitude of the Federal States. Seaboard of the seceding States. The Federal Navy. Energy of the Northern States. Additions to the Federal Fleet. Position of the Southerners at sea. Want of building yards and material. Commerce destroyers. The Merrimac and the Monitor. The Alabama and her consorts. Attitude of Great Britain. A royal proclamation. Preparation for blockade running. Amateurish efforts. Daring attempts. The Trent affair. Launched as a blockade runner. At the outbreak of the great American Civil War I was serving as assistant to a firm of Liverpool merchants trading chiefly with India and the United States. There was little in my life at the outset to foretell the full taste of danger, excitement, and venture which it was my fortune so early to enjoy. I had nothing to hope for beyond the usual life of office routine and a dim chance of a partnership abroad in the future. Young as I was, my interest in the coming struggle was deeply aroused. From the position I occupied its significance was brought home to me with the absorbing interest of a factor in my career. My own fortunes and those of my nearest friends seemed at their outset to be bound up in a piece of history that promised to leave its mark upon the world. Nowhere indeed out of America was the secession of the Southern States more keenly watched or canvassed than in Liverpool offices and upon the exchange of the city, which American trade had begotten and nursed. And the particular aspect of the impending war was most calculated to fill the imagination of youngsters like myself, who were awakening with the dreams of boyhood to the excitements of real life. It will be remembered that as soon as war was seen to be inevitable, President Lincoln sanctioned the heroic measure of attempting to choke secession by closing every orifice through which supplies could be drawn, and in the middle of April, 1861, rebellion was turned into civil war by his declaring the whole of the southern ports in a state of blockade. One of the immediate results of this act of President Lincoln was the prompt acknowledgment of the South as belligerents by England and France. Yet the Federal States persisted in maintaining that the Confederates were rebels, and that whosoever ventured to recognize them as belligerents must be regarded as friends of rebels and no friends of the North. They ignored the fact that their interference with neutral trade by this declaration of blockade was a virtual concession of belligerency to the South. A declaration of blockade presupposes a state of war and not mere rebellion, and the claim by the Federals of a right to seize neutral vessels attempting to break a blockade was one which can be exercised only by a belligerent. Exercised by anyone else, it is mere piracy. The effect of the news on the Liverpool Exchange it is needless to describe. By the scratch of a foreign pen a blow that was without precedent was struck in the chief trade of the port. So prodigious, indeed, was this first act of war, that for some time there was a doubt whether the neutral powers would recognize it. Only 5 years before, the powers assembled at Paris to wind up the Russian war had by solemn agreement declared as the final and universal law of nations that blockades to be binding must be effective, that is to say, that all the ports declared to be blockaded must be actually invested, or at least so closely watched by a cruising squadron that no ship can attempt to leave or enter without manifest danger of capture. Now, as the seaboard of the seceding states extended from the river Potomac in Virginia above Cape Hatteras down to the Rio Grande, the southern frontier of Texas, the coastline which the Federal Government had to watch effectively was some 3,000 miles in length. It was studded, moreover, at wide intervals with 10 or a dozen ports of first-rate importance. The total fleet of the United States when the war broke out consisted of less than 150 vessels, of which fully one-third were quite unserviceable. About 40 had crews, the rest were out of commission, and of these 10 or 11 of the best were lying at the Norfolk Navy Yard and fell into the hands of the Confederates. From these figures it will be seen, therefore, how impossible it was at first to maintain the blockade which the Northerners had declared, and how ineffectual it must be, seeing the length of coastline to be watched. With their usual energy, however, the Northerners set to work to increase their fleet. Within very few weeks over 150 vessels had been purchased and equipped for sea, and more than 50 ironclads and gunboats laid down and rapidly pushed forward toward completion. In addition to these a large number of river craft were requisitioned and protected by bullet-proof iron for service on the rivers, but even with these vigorous measures the blockade was anything but effective during the first 18 months or 2 years of the war. But the Northerners steadily and by almost superhuman efforts increased their fleet, and at the beginning of 1865 had so far succeeded that they possessed a fleet of nearly 700 vessels, of which some 150 were employed upon the blockade of Wilmington and Charleston alone, and patrolling their adjacent waters. It can easily be imagined, therefore, that attempting to get in and out of those ports in the latter months of 1864 and the early ones of 1865 was a very different business from the condition of affairs which existed earlier in the war. When the above ports fell into the hands of the Northerners, the blockade, considering the nature of the coastline and the types of vessels employed as blockaders and runners, was to all intents and purposes as effective as could be expected, for the blockading fleet consisted of almost every description of craft, from the old-fashioned 60-gun frigate to the modern Ironsides and Monitors, supplemented by dozens of merchant steamers converted into gunboats, not very formidable perhaps as warships, but still dangerous to blockade runners, especially when fast. The Southerners, on the other hand, were practically without any navy, with the exception of a few old wooden vessels which they seized at Norfolk Navy Yard at the outbreak of the war, and as they were almost entirely devoid of engineering works, material, or skilled labour, they could do but little to compete with the North upon the ocean. Their naval efforts were chiefly in the direction of supplying themselves from outside sources with commerce destroyers, such as the Alabama, Florida, Shenandoah, Georgia, etc. though from the wretched and scanty material which they possessed they succeeded in building 2 or 3 formidable ironclads. But their engines and armament were defective and their crews unskilled. Notwithstanding these drawbacks, however, the Merrimac, one of the old wooden steamers which they had seized at Norfolk, and which they had converted into an ironclad by covering the hull with railway iron, fought a gallant fight in Hampton Roads with the celebrated Monitor, after having destroyed on the previous day the Congress and Cumberland, 2 large northern warships. Another ironclad was also improvised by the Southerners at Mobile. She was called the Tennessee, and was altogether a more formidable craft than the Merrimac, both as regards armament and size, but like the Merrimac was terribly defective in engine power. When Farragut attacked Mobile she did considerable damage to his fleet, and for a time engaged it single-handedly, but at last was forced to haul down her flag. The Confederates also built another small ironclad at Wilmington on the same lines as the Merrimac and Tennessee, but unfortunately she ran aground on her passage down the river in order to attack the blockaders outside, and became a total wreck. In addition to the ships I have mentioned they possessed the Sumter, Rappahannock, Tallahassee steamers, and several sailing vessels, but with these vessels they had no chance against their powerful rivals in actual warfare, although the Alabama and her consorts swept the mercantile navy of the United States from the ocean. Seeing how inadequate the Federal Navy was at the time when the blockade was declared, there was certainly a strong case for treating President Lincoln's prohibition as a mere paper blockade. This, however, the British Government did not choose to do. At this time we were particularly anxious, in view of the coming international exhibition, to stand well with all men, and to be entangled in no foreign complications. Within a fortnight, therefore, on the receipt of the news, there came out a royal proclamation enjoining on all loyal subjects of the British Crown an attitude of strict neutrality, and solemnly admonishing them, under pain of Her Majesty's displeasure, to respect the Federal blockade. Needless to say, the proclamation awakened no respect whatever for the blockade. The lecture in the latter part of it was received in the spirit in which it was issued, as a piece of mere international courtesy, and those of Her Majesty's loyal subjects who were most affected by the new situation at once took steps to make the best of it. With due respect to the pain of Her Majesty's displeasure, we all knew that to run a foreign blockade could never be an offence against the laws of the realm, nor were we to be persuaded that any number of successful or unsuccessful attempts to enter the proclaimed ports could ever constitute a breach of neutrality. Firm after firm, with an entirely clear conscience, set about endeavouring to recoup itself for the loss of legitimate trade by the high profits to be made out of successful evasions of the Federal cruisers, and in Liverpool was awakened a spirit the like of which had not been known since the palmy days of the slave trade. It was a spirit of adventurous commerce savouring of the good old days of the French wars, when a lad might any day be called from the office to take his place on the deck of a privateer, and when daring spirits were always ready to steal away from a convoy and run the risk of capture or the chance of getting the cream of the market. The risks a blockade runner had to face were much the same, for as no government pretends to interfere with its citizens if they choose at their peril to trade in the face of a blockade, so no protection or redress is given them if they are caught red-handed. After official notification of blockade, any neutral vessel attempting to leave or enter a blockaded port forfeits its neutrality and places itself in the position of a hostile belligerent. The blockading force is entitled to treat such a ship in all respects as an enemy, and to use any means recognized in civilized warfare to drive off, capture, or destroy her. A crew so captured may be treated as prisoners of war, and their vessel carried into the captor's port, where after condemnation by an admiralty court she becomes his prize. Nor is any resistance to capture permitted, and a single blow or shot in his own defence turns the blockade runner into a pirate. Such was the exciting prospect our seamen and supercargoes had before them as they sailed for the southern ports. At first, of course, the risk was not thought very great. The Confederate ports were so many and far between, and the Federal navy so weak and unorganized, that vessels proceeded very much as if there were no blockade at all. The consequence was that as early as June, 1861, barely 2 months after the declaration of the blockade, several English vessels had been seized and condemned. Almost every week after that brought news of fresh captures. On the other hand, so many ships succeeded in getting through the widely scattered cruisers that the business still went on in the old clumsy way. We had neither of us learnt our trade then. The Federal captains, in hopes of fat prizes, cruised without order and chased wide, leaving ports open for newcomers, while our best idea of minimizing risks was to send out old unseaworthy slugs which we could well afford to lose. During the whole of the first year of the war it was in this amateurish way that things went on. A pretty regular tale of captures came in, and among the reports the mails brought home began to be whispered stories of daring attempts and hairbreadth escapes that set many a youngster kicking very impatiently under his desk. There came stories, too, of exasperated or ill-conditioned Federal captains who had behaved with unwarrantable bluster or tyranny to captured crews, and these began to awaken in mercantile circles a partisan leaning toward the South, which certainly did not exist at the beginning of the war. Some of us, it must be confessed, were growing oblivious of our duty as loyal subjects and of the solemn admonitions of the proclamation of neutrality, and for not a few the profit of making a successful run began to be seasoned with the pleasure of doing a good turn to the South. It is all bygone now. Runners can laugh over the rough knocks they sometimes got, and blockaders at the weary dance they were led. But in those days the ill feeling was very strong, and in the midst of all the fermenting irritation dropped the grating surprise of the Trent affair. Captain Wilkes, a Federal naval officer, commanding the West India station and engaged in blockade duties, took upon himself with more zeal than law to board the Trent, a British mail steamer, on the high seas, and seize from its deck 2 Confederate diplomatic agents who were passengers from Havana, accredited respectively to the French and the British governments. There is no doubt that the English nation was prepared to make any sacrifice to resent this outrage, and feeling ran very deep while we waited for the answer to our demands for redress. It cannot be denied that people on the other side made themselves a little ridiculous and irritating over our perfectly reasonable request for the surrender of the prisoners. Captain Wilkes was the hero of the hour, and blustering exultation over England the tune of the street. But in the White House heads were cooler, and in due course full reparation was made. Still, the spoiled child of diplomacy was not made to apologize. She barely expressed regret, and her omission of this international courtesy, combined with the extravagances of her press, confirmed in many Englishmen their inchoate partisanship for the South. Such was the state of things when, one day early in the year 1862, one of the partners in the house where I was serving called me into his room. After telling me how he and a few friends had purchased a steamer to have a try at the blockade, he asked me if I would care to go as supercargo. The answer was not doubtful. It was a stroke of luck far better than I had any right to expect at my age, for I was but 21, and needless to say I embraced my fortune with alacrity. "By all means," said I, "if I am not too young." My chief was good enough to say that he thought I was not too young, and so I was fairly launched in my career as a blockade runner. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Running the Blockade, by Thomas E. Taylor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. My first attempt on the Despatch. The Despatch. A blockade runner's cargo. The start for the West Indies. Put back to Queenstown. A terrific gale. Arrival at Nassau. the dangers of somnambulism, a haunt for buccaneers, a sleepy settlement, neutral territory, Southern firms running the blockade, Nassau as a basis of operations, the Dispatch condemned, efforts to meet a more stringent blockade, no cure, no pay, yellow fever, seizure of the Dispatch, a scheme for her rescue, her release. Were it only for the glimpse it gives of the state of the mercantile marine 30 years ago, my first voyage would be worth relating. Those who do not know how things were before the Plimsoll Act had made a revolution in merchant shipping would hardly believe what a man even in my position was expected to undergo without complaint. The steamer that had been purchased as a blockade runner, like most others at this time, was quite unfit for the purpose. To explain that she was a second-hand Irish cattle boat will convey to those who have voyaged in St. George's Channel a fair idea of what she was. Those who have not must understand that the average quality and condition of such craft are very low, and the Dispatch was not above the average. Her boilers were nearly worn out, her engines had been sadly neglected, and added to this, she drew far too much water for the hazardous entrances of the blockaded ports. But so indifferent were the ships at this time composing the blockading squadrons, so insufficient their numbers, and so inefficient their crews, that during the first year small sailing vessels of light draught and ordinary trading steamers were employed for the purpose of running the blockade. As has been shown, anything was thought good enough for a blockade runner then, and no time was lost in getting a cargo on board the Dispatch. In choosing this there was not much difficulty. In January a vessel flying the Confederate colours had put into Liverpool. She had run the blockade out, and was thus able to bring us not only the latest news of the Federal fleet, but also full information of the kind of cargo that would be most welcome in the Southern ports. The chief requirements were war materials of every sort, cloth for uniforms, buttons, thread, boots, stockings, and all clothing, medicines, salt, boiler iron, steel, copper, zinc, and chemicals. As it did not pay the merchants to ship heavy goods, the charge for freight per ton at Nassau being £80 to £100 in gold, a great portion of the cargo generally consisted of light goods, such as silks, laces, linens, quinine, etc., on which immense profits were made. At this time there were no mills and practically no manufactories in the Confederate States, so their means of production were nil. With the progress of the war their need of war material increased so sorely that in 1864 the Confederate Government limited the freight room on private account, and prohibited the importation of luxuries on the ground that if allowed to come in and be purchased the resources of the country would thereby be absorbed. As soon as her lading was complete a start was made, and what a start it was! It almost takes one's breath away in these belegislated days to think what the Dispatch must have looked like as she dropped down the Mersey. Her owners had taken advantage of their timely information to load her down, as low as she would float, with cargo consisting of ponderous cases and barrels of war material as well as light goods. Her deck was piled as high as the rail with coal, which had to be taken for the voyage to Nassau so as to avoid calling at any intermediate port. And she steamed out to brave the Atlantic with barely 1 foot of freeboard to her credit. Fortunately at the outset the weather kept fair, or my career must have had a very premature end, but thanks to an unusually fine February we wallowed along pretty comfortably till we had made some 400 miles to the southwest of Ireland. Here, however, through the carelessness of the engineers, the water was allowed to get so low in the boilers that the crowns to the furnaces of one of them were brought down. This means that only by a miracle was an explosion escaped, and that the Dispatch was entirely incapacitated from proceeding on her voyage. There was nothing to do but to put back for repairs, under one boiler, and we laid her head for Queenstown, thanking our stars it was no worse. It was 3 weeks before we could get to sea again, and then it was only to find ourselves once more on the brink of destruction. Before we had passed the Azores we came in for a terrific gale, which our overladen vessel was in no condition to meet. She speedily sprang a leak, so serious that in a very short time 4 of the 8 furnaces were extinguished, and the firemen were toiling at the rest up to their knees in water. For hours we looked for her to founder at any moment, as the grey breakers came rolling upon us, but somehow we managed to keep her afloat, and in due course were ploughing through the sunny waters of New Providence, and came to rest in the pretty harbour of Nassau. In those days I was a confirmed somnambulist, and one stormy night considerably astonished the officer of the watch by suddenly appearing on the bridge at midnight in bare feet and sleeping attire. Gripping him by the arm, I yelled, "For God's sake, respect the spars!" and turning on my heel returned to my cabin along the slippery deck with the steamer pitching and rolling in half a gale of wind. Of course the man thought I was mad, but was too astonished to seize me. Perhaps it was fortunate he did not do so, as to have been suddenly awakened in such a situation might have been anything but pleasant. I have for many years given up this dangerous habit. My last escapade occurred a long time ago, when one afternoon on board a P&O steamer, while taking a siesta, I suddenly jumped through the upper half door of my deck cabin and appeared in very light attire to the astonished gaze of some 50 passengers who were on the quarter deck. Fortunately a friend who was travelling with me managed to clasp me around the waist before I could jump overboard, and conducted me to my cabin none the worse, except for a skinned nose and barked shins. My fellow passengers, however, were evidently suspicious regarding my condition of mind, and looked very much askance when I appeared at dinner, thinking no doubt I was a lunatic and my friend my keeper. If that voyage had been almost enough to extinguish all the ardour I had for the life before me, Nassau was enough to set it well aflame again. The very thought of the place and of the exciting life there in those days, through the brief fever of its prosperity, sets my fancy tingling even now. Those few short years of extravagant importance, so sudden, so fitful, so completely passed away, are like a dream, and it seems almost impossible to revive a picture of what Nassau was when it found itself the base of operations against the great blockade. For centuries the little town had slumbered in complete obscurity. Depopulated and abandoned in the old days by the Spaniards, it had been occupied in Stuart times by Englishmen, and became a haunt of buccaneers. Then followed a century or so when it was a counter for diplomatists, and buccaneers settled down into wreckers, scraping together hard-earned living from the hurricane's leavings, and filling up the dull months between the stormy seasons with a little fruit-raising and sponge-fishing. Thus ingloriously had it faded into the obscurest of colonial capitals, with a population of some 3,000 or 4,000 souls. There lived and ruled the governor of the Bahamas, and there lived the chief justice and the bishop. These, with their modest following, and the officers of a West India regiment, and a few of the leading merchants and their families, made up almost all there was of society. Little more eventful ever broke the monotony of their feuds and friendships than the visit of one of the ships forming the West Indian squadron. Their Lilliputian politics went on from year to year, undisturbed and uncared for. There was nothing to mark the place in the world but a dusty pigeon-hole somewhere in the Colonial Office, which was filled and emptied and filled again. Every one was poor and every one lazily hopeless of any future development. A few schooners that came and went at infrequent intervals sufficed for all the trade there was, and the whole air of the sleepy settlement had been one of indolent acquiescence in its own obscurity. Then, past all expectations, came the war, and gold poured into its astonished lap. When first I saw the low line of houses nestling in the tropical vegetation of their gardens, a change had already taken place. The blockade had been on foot a bare year, but even then the quiet little port had asserted its new importance, and was overflowing with the turmoil of life. Many influential firms connected with the Southern States, and also English ones, had established agencies there, and almost every day steamers managed by those agents left the harbour to try their luck at evading the blockade, or arrived with cargoes of cotton from the beleaguered ports. Of course, seeing that Nassau was only some 560 miles from Charleston and 640 from Wilmington, and that moreover the chain of the Bahama islets extended some 100 miles in the direction of those ports, thus providing the extra protection of neutral territory for that distance, Nassau was par excellence the place for approaching the blockaded Atlantic ports of the South. Bermuda was its rival, but only in a lesser degree, as it was further off, and its conveniences as regards communication and accommodation were less. It is some 690 miles distant from Wilmington, the course being somewhat to the northward of west, and in the autumn especially it was seldom possible to get over without encountering a gale of wind. The one thing necessary for the blockading vessels being speed, their hulls were of the lightest description. This, coupled with the fact that they were always loaded down deep with coal, made a gale of wind an even worse enemy to encounter than a Federal cruiser. Havana was the best base for the Gulf ports, but as New Orleans was captured early on in the war, Galveston and Mobile were the only two blockaded ports that could be approached from it, and seeing the difficulty there was in procuring cotton at those places and in disposing of inward cargoes, the trade done with them was a flea bite compared with that from Charleston and Wilmington. At one time the trade of these two ports assumed very large proportions. The number of vessels employed in it was astonishing, and no sooner was one sunk, stranded, burnt, or captured, than two more seemed to take her place. Of Southern firms, Messrs. Fraser, Trenholm and Company did the largest business, as they were not only engaged largely on their own account in blockade-running enterprises, but they were also agents for the Southern States Government. Their representative in Nassau, Mr. J. B. Lafitte, a charming man in every respect, occupied a most prominent position, in fact more prominent than that of the Governor himself, and certainly he was remunerated better. After Fraser, Trenholm and Company came the English firm of Alex. Colley and Company, at that time one of great repute, represented by my friend L. G. Watson, and they from time to time were possessed of a large fleet of runners commanded mostly by naval officers. After them came the house I represented, which from first to last owned some 15 steamers, and after them a number of small firms owning perhaps one, possibly two, boats apiece, so that in the aggregate the number of boats and the capital employed was enormous. So nicely has nature dispersed the Bahamas that they afforded neutral water to within 50 miles of the American coast, and no sooner was the blockade declared than the advantages of Nassau as a basis of operations were recognized and embraced. The harbour was alive with shipping, the quays were piled with cotton, the streets were thronged with busy life. So far grown and established indeed did I find the business of blockade running that I was seized with a sense of being late in the field and with a desire to rush in and reclaim lost time. Fortunately there was little to delay us, so full of impatience and excitement we set about preparing for a run. Our supplies were ready, and in the harbour lay a barque which had been sent out to act as my coal store ship, and afterwards she was to carry home any cotton we should succeed in getting out. Nothing seemed wanting for a start, but I was doomed to disappointment. No sooner did I begin to pick up the lore of the place than the unpleasant truth came out. Even in the early days there were men whose tales of successful trips gave them a reputation as blockade experts, and every one of them condemned the despatch as wholly unfit for the work. The blockade was already gaining system and coherence. The Northerners, no longer content with simply blockading the Confederate ports, had established a chain of powerful cruisers which patrolled the seas from the American coast to the very entrance of Nassau Harbor. The old despatch was much too slow to stand a ghost of a chance of escaping them. Moreover, she drew so much water that the Charleston bar was the only one she could hope to get over, and it was now so strictly watched that a craft so unhandy was certain to be captured in the attempt. After all I had gone through it was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was impossible for a man entirely without experience, as I was then, to ignore the exasperating unanimity of the experts. Therefore, after consultation with the local agent of my firm, I resolved to sell my cargoes on the spot and get both vessels home to the best advantage. Still I was not without consolation. Although within a year of the beginning of the blockade the North, in pursuit of a steady policy, had secured various bases on the blockaded coast for the use of their squadrons, which were rapidly being augmented by improved types of vessels, and had thereby reduced considerably the number of points to be watched, and though the business of blockade running was now becoming risky, no time was lost in endeavouring to meet the new demands on our energy and skill. If the Federals were learning the business, so were we. It was clear that the blockade runners must not only be increased in numbers but must be improved in type. The day of sailing vessels and ordinary trading steamers was over. Accordingly steamers of great speed were ordered to be built expressly for the service. I knew that at home one of the first vessels especially built for blockade running had been laid down and was rapidly being completed, also that she was to be placed under my charge as soon as ready. Accordingly, toward the end of the year, after making my preliminary arrangements, I went home full of hope, although sadly impatient at the year's delay caused by all the mistakes and disasters. Before getting there, however, I had an anxious time to pass through. It was necessary to provide some employment for the Despatch and her consort the bark Astoria, and as no direct freight could be obtained for either, I had to cast about for intermediate work for them. The sailing vessel I dispatched to New York, and in an evil moment I made a contract, on the no cure no pay principle, for the Despatch to tow a disabled steamer to the same port, arranging to go myself in the mail steamer so as to meet both ships there. After I had completed my Nassau business I did so, and on my arrival at New York I was disgusted to find both vessels in quarantine with yellow fever on board, also that the Despatch had dropped her tow off Port Royal in a gale of wind and come on without her. This was a pretty mess for a youngster to be in a strange port like New York, where everything connected with Nassau was looked upon with suspicion, and the fear of yellow fever was rampant. It was my first intimate acquaintance with the disease, but fortunately the cooler climate in time worked its own cure, and after encountering innumerable quarantine difficulties, both vessels were given pratique, but not before several deaths had occurred. In the interim the Despatch was seized for $30,000 at the suit of the owners of the steamer which she had attempted to tow, as damages for letting her go, and she was only released from quarantine to find herself in the clutches of the marshal of the port. As I had no means for providing the required security, the captain and I formed rather a mad scheme to rescue her from his clutches. The captain was to get her under way quietly, taking the marshal's officer with him, while I remained behind to lull suspicion. Early one misty morning he accomplished this successfully and began to steam slowly down the bay. But the revenue cutter lying close alongside gave the alarm, and the forts opened fire at once. For a time he held on, and was nearly out of range when the pilot, fearing, I presume, for his share in the transaction, declined to go further, and there was nothing for it but ignominiously to return. Of course all this made my position worse, but, to make a long story short, a kind friend, a prominent New York banker, went bail for me, and the Despatch was released and loaded for home. Finally I compromised the case for about $2,000. The bark I sent on to St. John, and following her myself by steamer, I chartered her to carry home a cargo of timber. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Running the Blockade by Thomas E. Taylor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Banshee No. 1. A landmark in marine architecture. The lines of the Banshee. Her crew. Serious defects. Loss of time. Driven back off the Fastnet. Arrival at Madeira. Northerners and the duties of neutrals. Southern sympathies. Federal cruisers. Nearing the Bahamas. Admiral Wilkes. The Banshee runs into Nassau. Preparing for business. A daring and successful commander. Engineer Erskine. Tom Burroughs. After my disappointment it will easily be imagined how anxious I was to know how my new ship was progressing. On reaching Liverpool my first care was to visit the yard where she was being built. To my great delight I found her almost completed, and a marvel of shipbuilding as it seemed to us then. For the Banshee, as she was called, may claim to be a landmark not only in the development of blockade, but also of marine architecture. With the exception of a boat built for Livingstone of African fame, she was, I believe, the first steel ship ever laid down. The new blockade runner was a paddle boat, built of steel, on extraordinarily fine lines, 214 feet long and 20 feet beam, and drew only 8 feet of water. Her masts were mere poles without yards, and with the least possible rigging. In order to attain greater speed in a seaway she was built with a turtle-back deck forward. She was of 217 tons net register, and had an anticipated sea speed of 11 knots, with a coal consumption of 30 tons a day. Her crew, which included 3 engineers and 12 firemen, consisted of 36 hands all told. Steel shipbuilding was then in its infancy, and the Banshee was the first of a fleet that was soon to become famous. There were several similar steamers already in hand, and although no one could tell how they would behave when exposed to the great seas of the Atlantic, the best results were anticipated from the strength and lightness of their materials. They were expected to develop a buoyancy beyond everything that had yet been seen, and American naval officers awaited their arrival on the scene of activity with an interest as great as ours. The Banshee was ready for sea early in 1863. And I had the satisfaction of finding myself steaming down the Mersey in the first steel vessel that ever crossed the Atlantic. Like most first attempts, however, she was far from a success, and by the time we reached Queenstown she had betrayed serious defects. To begin with, the speed she developed was extremely disappointing. With the idea of protecting her boilers from shot, they had been constructed so low that they had not sufficient steam space. And worse than this, the plates of which she was built being only 1/8 and 3/16 of an inch thick, she proved so weak that her decks leaked like a sieve. It was found absolutely necessary to put into Queenstown and make such alterations as were possible. Thus 3 more weeks were lost, and when at last we were able to put out again it was only to be driven back off the Fastnet by a southwesterly gale, which swept the Banshee clean from stem to stern of everything on deck, filled her fore stokehole, and compelled us to return for fresh repairs. Considering how frail the vessel was, the wonder is not that the Banshee was driven back, but that she ever got across the Atlantic at all. Still her next start was successful, and reaching Madeira without adventure, excepting a close shave from being run down in the Bay of Biscay by a French barque, she began her real career as a blockade runner. For even here danger began. At this time a great deal of bad blood was caused by the way in which the Northerners, in their efforts to enforce a blockade, were extending the doctrine of the operations permissible to belligerents. But there is no doubt now that they were perfectly right. True, the proposition that a belligerent might seize a neutral ship for attempted breach of blockade thousands of miles away from the blockaded coast was one that would have been condemned by the old school of international lawyers as nothing less than monstrous, and by none more energetically than the great publicists who have so richly adorned the American bench. So far were such doctrines from being recognized that it was generally held that a vessel making a long ocean voyage might even call at a blockaded port to inquire if the blockade was still existent, and no matter how suspicious her intentions, she was entitled to a warning before being captured. But it must be remembered that those were the days of sailing ships, which might have been without any news of passing events for months. No blockade of any importance had yet been subjected to the new conditions of steam navigation, and it was unreasonable to expect that the blockaders would hold themselves bound by rules which never contemplated the existing state of things. If the Americans were stretching the theory of blockade, it was only because we were extending its practice. It was not to be argued that if we were building a whole fleet of steamers for the express purpose of defying their cruisers, they were not justified in trying to intercept them at any point they chose. From the very outset the voyages of these vessels showed them to be guilty, and the most barefaced advocate could hardly have maintained without shame that they were protected by their ostensibly neutral destination, when the destination was a notorious nest of offence like Nassau. Still, the new methods were none the less galling to the susceptibilities of British merchants, who of all men claimed to go and come on the high seas as they pleased, and every day those engaged in the service became more pronounced in their southern sympathies, and louder in their denunciations of the Northerners' high-handed ways. In order to economize coal, the Banshee was taking the usual course adopted by sailing vessels. This was the ordinary practice of runners, and as the Federals grew bolder, stronger, and more exasperated, they stretched their patrolling cruisers further and further across the Atlantic, till a few weeks after the Banshee left Madeira, a Federal ship of war was actually lying in wait for one of the new runners at the mouth of Funchal Bay. The moment the British vessel put to sea, the American opened fire upon her as mercilessly as though she were coming out of Charleston or Wilmington instead of out of a neutral port, and nothing but superior speed and clever handling saved her from destruction within sight and sound of neutral territory. The Banshee, having been earlier in the field, was more fortunate, but the voyage was none the less exciting as she neared the Bahamas. The neighboring seas were alive with cruisers who, regarding everything bound for Nassau as prima facie guilty of an intention to break the blockade, seized any vessel they had a mind to on the chance of getting her condemned in the United States courts. Indeed, the principal centres of blockade running were almost as closely invested as the ports of the Confederate States, and only a few months before the notorious Captain Wilkes, now promoted to the rank of Admiral for his popular but unwarrantable conduct in the Trent affair, had been further distinguishing himself by literally blockading Bermuda with the squadron under his command. Although from first to last the British Government showed nothing but sympathy for the Northern States in the difficult task of their blockade, and although they never once complained of a decision of the American courts, or in any way countenanced the runners, this was going a little too far. A protest was unavoidable, and considering the antecedents of Admiral Wilkes, the Federal Government could hardly complain if two British warships were ordered to watch the overzealous officer. It would appear that at the White House the representations from St. James's were regarded as reasonable, for after this the American cruisers kept a more deferential distance. The Banshee, at any rate, was able to run into Nassau without being overhauled, and her arrival there caused a great sensation, as being the first boat specially built for the service. Having received the congratulations of my many friends at Nassau upon possessing so fine a tool to work with, I at once set about getting her ready for a trip as soon as the nights set in dark enough. For so vigilant had the blockading force become by this time, that a successful run was considered practically impossible, except on moonless nights. Invisibility, care, and determination were the secrets of success, and to this end the Banshee was carefully prepared. Everything aloft was taken down, till nothing was left standing but the two lower masts, with small cross trees for a lookout man on the fore, and the boats were lowered to the level of the rails. The whole ship was then painted a sort of dull white, the precise shade of which was so nicely ascertained by experience before the end of the war, that a properly dressed runner on a dark night was absolutely indiscernible at a cable's length. So particular were captains on this point that some of them even insisted on their crews wearing white at night, holding that one black figure on the bridge or on deck was enough to betray an otherwise invisible vessel. Perfect as the Banshee looked when her toilet was complete, I was even more fortunate in my crew. For captain I had Steele, one of the most daring and successful commanders the time brought out. Absolutely devoid of fear, never flurried, decided and ready in emergency, and careful as a mother, he was the beau ideal of a blockade runner. Already he had served his apprenticeship to the trade and knew what failure meant, for while in command of the Tubal-Cain he had been captured on his very first trip, and, after tasting for a short time the hospitality of an American prison, had been released, richer by the experience, but in no wise daunted. The chief engineer, Erskine, too, had seen service, having worked as second engineer on board the Confederate cruiser Oreto, when the famous Captain Maffitt ran her into Savannah. As the engines of a blockade runner are her arm, her success must necessarily in great measure depend on the qualities of her engineer, and it would have been hard to find a better man for the task than Erskine. Cool in danger, full of resource in sudden difficulty, and as steady as the tide, he was yet capable of fearlessly risking everything and straining to the last pound when the word came in one of those rousing forms of expression with which old Steele was wont to notify down the engine-room tube that the critical moment had come. For pilot, a Wilmington man had been sent out by our agents there, and was waiting for me at Nassau. He, too, turned out a jewel. He knew his port like his own face, and the most trying situations or heaviest firing could never put him off or disturb his serene self-possession. For all his duties he had an instinct that approached genius. On the blackest night he could always make out a blockader several minutes before anyone else could, and so acute at last did this sense become, that it used to be a byword that Tom Burroughs at last got to smell a cruiser long before he could see her. Through the ignorance or cowardice of the pilot, vessels were frequently lost, and to obtain a good pilot was as troublesome as it was essential. The risk they ran was great, for if captured they were never exchanged, but their pay, which frequently amounted to £700 or £800 a round trip, was proportionate to the risk. Thus well equipped and laden with arms, gunpowder, boots, and all kinds of contraband of war, as soon as the moon was right, the Banshee stole out of Nassau for the first time to make the best of her way to Wilmington. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Running the Blockade by Thomas E. Taylor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The Banshee's First Run-In. The Approach to Wilmington. Fort Fisher. Tactics of the Blockading Squadron. Reason of the Banshee's Success. The Lookout Man. The Dangers of Blockade Running. The Favorite Course into Wilmington. All Lights Out. An Anxious Moment. Taking Soundings. In the Midst of the Enemy. A False Reckoning. The Big Hill. Attacked by Gunboats. Fort Fisher Wide Awake. Safely over the bar. The Days of Champagne Cocktails. Wilmington was the first port I attempted. In fact, with the exception of one run to Galveston, it was always our destination. It had many advantages. Though furthest from Nassau, it was nearest to headquarters at Richmond, and from its situation was very difficult to watch effectively. It was here, moreover, that my firm had established its agency as soon as they had resolved to take up the blockade running business. The town itself lies some 16 miles up the Cape Fear River, which falls into the ocean at a point where the coast forms the sharp salient angle from which the river takes its name. Off its mouth lies a delta known as Smith's Island, which not only emphasizes the obnoxious formation of the coast, but also divides the approach to the port into two widely separated channels, so that in order to guard the approach to it a blockading force is compelled to divide into two squadrons. At one entrance of the river lies Fort Fisher, a work so powerful that the blockaders, instead of lying in the estuary, were obliged to form roughly a semicircle out of range of its guns, and the falling away of the coast on either side of the entrance further increased the extent of ground they had to cover. The system they adopted in order to meet the difficulty was extremely well conceived, and did we not know to the contrary, it would have appeared complete enough to ensure the capture of every vessel so foolhardy as to attempt to enter or come out. Across either entrance an inshore squadron was stationed at close intervals. In the daytime the steamers composing this squadron anchored, but at night they got under way and patrolled in touch with the flagship, which as a rule remained at anchor. Further out there was a cordon of cruisers, and outside these again detached gunboats, keeping at such a distance from the coast as they calculated a runner coming out would traverse between the time of high water on Wilmington Bar and sunrise, so that if any blockade runner coming out got through the two inner lines in the dark she had every chance of being snapped up at daybreak by one of the 3rd Division. Besides these special precautions for Wilmington, there must not be forgotten the ships engaged in the general service of the blockade, consisting, in addition to those detailed to watch Nassau and other bases, of free cruisers that patrolled the Gulf Stream. From this it will be seen readily that from the moment the Banshee left Nassau Harbor till she had passed the protecting forts at the mouth of Cape Fear River, she and those on board her could never be safe from danger, or free for a single hour from anxiety. But although at this time the system was already fairly well developed, the Northerners had not yet enough ships at work to make it as effective as it afterward became. The Banshee's engines proved so unsatisfactory that under ordinary conditions 9 or 10 knots was all we could get out of her. She was therefore not permitted to run any avoidable risks, and to this I attribute her extraordinary success when better boats failed. As long as daylight lasted a man was never out of the cross trees, and the moment a sail was seen the Banshee's stern was turned to it till it was dropped below the horizon. The lookout man, to quicken his eyes, had $1 for every sail he sighted, and if it were seen from the deck first he was fined 5. This may appear excessive, but the importance in blockade running of seeing before you are seen is too great for any chance to be neglected, and it must be remembered that the pay of ordinary seamen for each round trip in and out was from £50 to £60. Following these tactics we crept noiselessly along the shores of the Bahamas, invisible in the darkness, and ran on unmolested for the first 2 days out, though our course was often interfered with by the necessity of avoiding hostile vessels. Then came the anxious moment on the 3rd, when, her position having been taken at noon to see if she were near enough to run under the guns of Fort Fisher before the following daybreak, it was found there was just time, but none to spare for accidents or delay. Still the danger of lying out another day so close to the blockaded port was very great, and rather than risk it we resolved to keep straight on our course and chance being overtaken by daylight before we were under the fort. Now the real excitement began, and nothing I have ever experienced can compare with it. Hunting, pig sticking, steeple chasing, big game shooting, polo, I have done a little of each, all have their thrilling moments, but none can approach running a blockade, and perhaps my readers can sympathize with my enthusiasm when they consider the dangers to be encountered. After 3 days of constant anxiety and little sleep, in threading our way through a swarm of blockaders, and the accuracy required to hit in the nick of time the mouth of a river only half a mile wide, without lights, and with a coastline so low and featureless that as a rule the first intimation we had of its nearness was the dim white line of the surf. There were of course many different plans of getting in, but this time the favourite dodge was to run up some 15 or 20 miles to the north of Cape Fear, so as to round the northernmost of the blockaders, instead of dashing right through the inner squadron, then to creep down close to the surf till the river was reached, and this was the course the Banshee intended to adopt. We steamed cautiously on until nightfall. The night proved dark, but dangerously clear and calm. No lights were allowed, not even a cigar. The engine-room hatchways were covered with tarpaulins, at the risk of suffocating the unfortunate engineers and stokers in the almost insufferable atmosphere below, but it was absolutely imperative that not a glimmer of light should appear. Even the binnacle was covered, and the steersman had to see as much of the compass as he could through a conical aperture carried almost up to his eyes. With everything thus in readiness we steamed on in silence except for the stroke of the engines and the beat of the paddle floats, which in the calm of the night seemed distressingly loud. All hands were on deck, crouching behind the bulwarks, and we on the bridge, namely the captain, the pilot, and I, were straining our eyes into the darkness. Presently Burroughs made an uneasy movement. "Better get a cast of the lead, Captain," I heard him whisper.
A muttered order down the engine room tube was Steele's reply, and the Banshee slowed and then stopped. It was an anxious moment, while a dim figure stole into the fore chains, for there is always a danger of steam blowing off when engines are unexpectedly stopped, and that would have been enough to betray our presence for miles around. In a minute or two came back the report, 16 fathoms, sandy bottom with black specks. "We are not as far in as I thought, Captain," said Burroughs, "and we are too far to the southward. Port 2 points and go a little faster." As he explained, we must be well to the northward of the speckled bottom before it was safe to head for the shore, and away we went again. In about an hour Burroughs quietly asked for another sounding. Again she was gently stopped, and this time he was satisfied. "Starboard and go ahead easy" was the order now, and as we crept in not a sound was heard but that of the regular beat of the paddle float, still dangerously loud in spite of our snail's pace. Suddenly Burroughs gripped my arm. "There's one of them, Mr. Taylor," he whispered, "on the starboard bow." In vain I strained my eyes to where he pointed, not a thing could I see, but presently I heard Steele say beneath his breath, "All right, Burroughs, I see her. Starboard a little, steady," was the order passed aft. A moment afterwards I could make out a long, low, black object on the starboard side, lying perfectly still. Would she see us? That was the question. But no, though we passed within 100 yards of her we were not discovered, and I breathed again. Not very long after we had dropped her, Burroughs whispered, "Steamer on the port bow," and another cruiser was made out close to us. "Hard a port," said Steele, and round she swung, bringing our friend upon our beam. Still unobserved, we crept quietly on, when all at once a third cruiser shaped itself out of the gloom right ahead and steamed slowly across our bows. "Stop her," said Steele in a moment, and as we lay like dead our enemy went on and disappeared in the darkness. It was clear there was a false reckoning somewhere, and that instead of rounding the head of the blockading line we were passing through the very centre of it. However, Burroughs was now of opinion that we must be inside the squadron, and advocated making the land. So, slow ahead we went, again, until the low-lying coast and the surf line became dimly visible. Still we could not tell where we were, and as time was getting on alarmingly near dawn, the only thing to do was to creep down along the surf as close in and as fast as we dared. It was a great relief when we suddenly heard Burroughs say, "It's all right, I see the big hill." The big hill was a hillock about as high as a full-grown oak tree, but it was the most prominent feature for miles on that dreary coast, and served to tell us exactly how far we were from Fort Fisher. And fortunate it was for us we were so near. Daylight was already breaking, and before we were opposite the fort we could make out 6 or 7 gunboats, which steamed rapidly toward us and angrily opened fire. Their shots were soon dropping close around us, an unpleasant sensation when you know you have several tons of gunpowder under your feet. To make matters worse, the North Breaker shoal now compelled us to haul off the shore and steam further out. It began to look ugly for us, when all at once there was a flash from the shore, followed by a sound that came like music to our ears, that of a shell whirring over our heads. It was Fort Fisher, wide awake and warning the gunboats to keep their distance. After a parting broadside they steamed sulkily out of range, and in half an hour we were safely over the bar. A boat put off from the fort, and then—well, it was the days of champagne cocktails, not whiskies and sodas, and one did not run a blockade every day. For my part, I was mightily proud of my first attempt and my baptism of fire. Blockade running seemed the pleasantest and most exhilarating of pastimes. I did not know then what a very serious business it could be. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Running the Blockade by Thomas E. Taylor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Fort Fisher and Wilmington. Colonel William Lamb. A battery of Whitworth guns. Mrs. Lamb. A lovely Puritan maiden. An historical cottage. British naval officers.
The Santa Claus of the War. Admiral Porter's Fleet. Visit of General Curtis and Colonel Lamb to Fort Fisher. Identifying Historic Spots. Strict Quarantine. Cheerful Slaves. Open House on board the Banshee. Reckless Loading. An Impudent Plan. The Minnesota. A Simple Maneuver. A Triumphant Success. It was now that I made the acquaintance, soon to ripen into a warm friendship, of Colonel William Lamb, the commandant of Fort Fisher, a man of whose courtesy, courage, and capacity all the English who knew him spoke in the highest terms. Originally a Virginian lawyer, and afterwards the editor of a newspaper, he volunteered at the outbreak of the war, and, rising rapidly to the grade of colonel, was given the command of Fort Fisher, a post which he filled with high distinction till its fall in 1865. With the blockade runners he was immensely popular. Always on the alert and ever ready to reach a helping hand, he seemed to think no exertion too great to assist their operations, and many a smart vessel did his skill and activity snatch from the very jaws of the blockaders. He came to be regarded by the runners as their guardian angel, and it was no small support in the last trying moments of a run to remember who was in Fort Fisher. So much did we value his services and so grateful were we for them that at my suggestion my firm subsequently presented him with a battery of 6 Whitworth guns, of which he was very proud, and good use he made of them in keeping the blockaders at a respectful distance. They were guns with a great range, which many a cruiser found to its cost when venturing too close in chase down the coast. Lamb would gallop them down behind the sand hills by aid of mules, and open fire upon the enemy before he was aware of his danger. Neither must I forget his charming wife, alas, now numbered among the majority. Her hospitality and kindness were unbounded, and many a pleasant social evening have I and my brother blockade runners spent in her little cottage outside the fort. The following extracts from Southern historical papers written by Colonel Lamb a few years ago will doubtless interest my readers; also the account, copied from the Wilmington Messenger, of a meeting which took place lately between him and General Curtis at Fort Fisher. In the fall of 1857 a lovely Puritan maiden, still in her teens, was married in Grace Church, Providence, Rhode Island, to a Virginia youth, just past his majority, who brought her to his home in Norfolk, a typical ancestral homestead, where beside the white folks there was quite a colony of family servants, from the pickaninny just able to crawl to the old gray-headed mammy who had nursed old Massa. She soon became enamored of her surroundings, and charmed with the devotion of her colored maid, whose sole duty it was to wait upon her young missus. When the John Brown raid burst upon the South and her husband was ordered to Harper's Ferry, there was not a more indignant matron in all Virginia, and when at last secession came, the South did not contain a more enthusiastic little rebel. On the 15th of May, 1862, a few days after the surrender of Norfolk to the Federals, by her father-in-law, then mayor, amid the excitement attending a captured city, her son Willie was born. Cut off from her husband and subjected to the privations and annoyances incidental to a subjugated community, her father insisted upon her coming with her children to his home in Providence; but notwithstanding she was in a luxurious home with all that paternal love could do for her, she preferred to leave all these comforts to share with her husband the dangers and privations of the South. She vainly tried to persuade Stanton, Secretary of War, to let her and her 3 children, with a nurse, return to the South. Finally he consented to let her go by flag of truce from Washington to City Point, but without a nurse, and as she was unable to manage 3 little ones, she left the youngest with his grandparents, and with the 2 others bravely set out for Dixie. The generous outfit of every description which had been prepared for the journey and which was carried to the place of embarkation was ruthlessly cast aside by the inspectors on the wharf, and no tears or entreaties or offers of reward by the parents availed to pass anything save a scanty supply of clothing and other necessaries.
Arriving in the South, the brave young mother refused the proffer of a beautiful home in Wilmington, the occupancy of the grand old mansion at Orton, on the Cape Fear River, but insisted upon taking up her abode, with her children and their colored nurse, in the upper room of a pilot's house, where they lived until the soldiers of the garrison built her a cottage 1 mile north of Fort Fisher on the Atlantic beach. In both of these homes she was occasionally exposed to the shot and shell fired from blockaders at belated blockade runners. It was a quaint abode, constructed in most primitive style, with 3 rooms around one big chimney, in which North Carolina pine knots supplied heat and light on winter nights. The cottage became historic, and was famed for the frugal but tempting meals which its charming hostess would prepare for her distinguished guests. Besides the many illustrious Confederate Army and Navy officers who were delighted to find this bit of sunshiny civilization on the wild sandy beach, ensconced among the sand dunes and straggling pines and blackjack, many celebrated English naval officers enjoyed its hospitality under assumed names: Roberts, afterwards the renowned Hobart Pasha, who commanded the Turkish navy; Murray, now Admiral Murray Aynsley, long since retired, after having been rapidly promoted for gallantry and meritorious services in the British navy; the brave but unfortunate Hugh Burgoyne, V.C., who went down in the British ironclad Captain in the Bay of Biscay; and the chivalrous Hewitt, who won the Victoria Cross in the Crimea, and was knighted for his services as ambassador to King John of Abyssinia, and who, after commanding the Queen's yacht, died lamented as Admiral Hewitt. Besides these, there were many genial and gallant merchant captains, among them Halpin, who afterwards commanded the Great Eastern while laying ocean cables, and famous war correspondents: Hon. Francis C. Lawley, M.P., correspondent of the London Times, and Frank Visitelli of the London Illustrated News, afterwards murdered in the Soudan. Nor must the plucky Tom Taylor be forgotten, supercargo of the Banshee and the Night Hawk, who by his coolness and daring escaped with a boat's crew from the hands of the Federals after capture off the fort, and who was endeared to the children as the Santa Claus of the war. At first the little Confederate was satisfied with pork and potatoes, corn bread, and rye coffee with sorghum sweetening; but after the blockade runners made her acquaintance, the impoverished storeroom was soon filled to overflowing, notwithstanding her heavy requisitions on it for the post hospital, the sick and wounded soldiers and sailors always being a subject of her tenderest solicitude, and often the hard-worked and poorly fed colored hands blessed the little lady of the cottage for a tempting treat. Full of stirring events were the 2 years passed in the cottage on Confederate Point. The drowning of Mrs. Rose Greenough, the famous Confederate spy, off Fort Fisher, and the finding of her body, which was tenderly cared for, and the rescue from the waves, half dead, of Professor Holcomb, and his restoration, were incidents never to be forgotten. Her fox hunting with horse and hounds, the narrow escapes of friendly vessels, the fights over blockade runners driven ashore, the execution of deserters, and the loss of an infant son, whose little spirit went out with the tide one sad summer night, all contributed to the reality of this romantic life. When Porter's fleet appeared off Fort Fisher, December, 1864, it was storm-bound for several days, and the little family with their household goods were sent across the river to Orton before Butler's powder ship blew up. After the Christmas victory over Porter and Butler, the little heroine insisted upon coming back to her cottage, although her husband had procured a home of refuge in Cumberland County. General Whiting protested against her running the risk, for on dark nights her husband could not leave the fort, but she said if the firing became too hot she would run behind the sand hills as she had done before, and come she would. The fleet appeared unexpectedly on the night of the 12th of January, 1865. It was a dark night, and when the lights of the fleet were reported, her husband sent a courier to the cottage to instruct her to pack up quickly and be prepared to leave with children and nurse as soon as he could come to bid them good-bye. The garrison barge with a trusted crew was stationed at Craig's Landing near the cottage. After midnight, when all necessary orders were given for the coming attack, the Colonel mounted his horse and rode to the cottage, but all was dark and silent. He found the message had been delivered, but his brave wife had been so undisturbed by the news that she had fallen asleep and no preparations for a retreat had been made. Precious hours had been lost, and as the fleet would soon be shelling the beach and her husband have to return to the fort, he hurried them into the boat as soon as dressed, with only what could be gathered up hastily, leaving dresses, toys, and household articles to fall into the hands of the foe. The extraordinary circumstance occurred yesterday of a visit to Fort Fisher by General N. M. Curtis and Colonel William Lamb, who were pitted against each other in deadly strife at that historic spot on the occurrence of both the battles there during the Civil War, the one commencing 24th December, 1864, and the other 13th January, 1865. Colonel Lamb was in Washington a few days ago, and made an engagement with General Curtis to visit the old fort. They consequently met in Norfolk last Thursday morning, and came on to Wilmington, arriving here that night. Yesterday morning they took the steamer Wilmington at 9:30 o'clock, and accompanied by T. W. Clawson of the Messenger, the three were landed at the Rocks and were sent ashore in one of the Wilmington's small boats, the gangway and wharf having been swept away during the gale of 13th October. From the Rocks the party walked to Fort Fisher, and together the old heroes went from one end of the fort to the other, identifying Colonel Lamb's headquarters and locating the position of the batteries, the magazines, the salients, the sally port, and other historic spots. General Curtis explained the route of his advance upon the fort at the last battle, when the fort was captured, and pointed out the portion of the parapet which he assaulted and scaled, and where the first flag of the invading army was planted on the ramparts. The batteries at which the first fierce hand-to-hand fights occurred were discussed as the party walked over them, and General Curtis pointed out about the spot inside the works where he fell, desperately and almost fatally wounded by a piece of shell that struck him over the left eye, and carried away a large piece of the frontal bone and destroyed the eye. He was believed to be killed, and when some of his soldiers were ordered to take him to the rear so that his body could be shipped north, they dragged his body over the rough ground for some distance, so that his clothing was torn and his back was bleeding from cuts made by such rough treatment. Orders had been given for a box in which to ship his body to his home in New York. Colonel Lamb, the hero on the Confederate side, who was in command of the fort at both battles, explained the positions held by the brave defenders of the fort, and also pointed out about the spot where he was shot down, a Minnie ball having broken his hip, and also where General Whiting received his death wound. Strange to say, all three were wounded within a few yards of each other. Colonel Lamb's wound came within an ace of proving fatal, and as it was he was on crutches for several years. The old fort is now a heap of ruins, consisting of mounds of sand, where the batteries were stationed. In front of the land face from which the assault was made by the United States troops under General Curtis, and right on the position held by his regiment, the recent storm has unearthed a great many bones of the brave fellows who fell in the battle. It is not known whether they wore the blue or the gray, but it is quite probable that they were some of General Curtis's troops. From the fort the party proceeded up the beach for a mile and a half, and visited the cottage which Colonel Lamb occupied with his family and made his general headquarters. It is now occupied by a fisherman. From Craig's Landing nearby the party took a sailboat and were carried back to the Rocks by the Craig brothers. When the boat was run ashore it grounded in shallow water about 15 feet from dry land, and the only alternative left was to strip shoes and footwear and roll up pants and wade out. General Curtis, who was a man of powerful frame and sound health, soon stepped over the boat's side and into the water, and as Colonel Lamb's health made him cautious about going into the water, General Curtis offered to carry him on his back to dry land. The messenger representative, being a duffer of good frame and strength, and being the younger by half, interposed in relief of General Curtis, and so Colonel Lamb rode on the Scribe to the shore. The newspaper man then wanted to kick himself for not allowing Colonel Lamb to ride his friend the enemy, for he could have witnessed the remarkable instance of a brave and distinguished Federal officer carrying on his back the illustrious Confederate who in years that are gone was raising old Harry with shot and shell to keep the General at a safe distance. These two men were heroes of the right stripe, and we can raise our hats in honor and admiration of them for the rich heritage which their manhood and bravery leaves to Americans. After accepting the hospitality of Mr. Henry Wood, a fisherman at the Rocks, who had prepared some coffee and oysters for the party, the Wilmington came in sight at 3 o'clock, and she was boarded for the return to Wilmington. On the trip down Colonel Lamb had bought a lot of fine fat coots to be cooked for lunch at the Rocks, but he forgot these, and they were left on the steamer. Imagine the happiness of the party when they got aboard to find that the courteous Captain John Harper had had the birds cooked and sent them in with some delightful bread. General Curtis and Colonel Lamb, after returning to the city, were hospitably entertained at the Cape Fear Club. General Curtis was a colonel at the assault on Fort Fisher, but he won his general's epaulettes there. By the way, he was wounded in 6 places on the day the fort was captured. He served 4 years and 8 months in the Federal Army, having volunteered in April, 1861. Wilmington, North Carolina, Messenger. After this digression I must return to our movements on board the Banshee. Having obtained pratique, for the quarantine was very strict, and a local pilot, rendered necessary by the river being unbuoyed and strewn with torpedoes, we ran up at once to Wilmington. Here I found our agent, Tom Power, who had an outward cargo ready for me, and the cheerful heartiness with which the slaves set about discharging our inward one was a pleasant surprise. If I hadn't been told they were slaves, I should never have discovered it. Everything had to be done at high pressure, for it was important to get out as quickly as possible, so as to try another run while the dark nights lasted, and loading went merrily on. I therefore did my best to win the goodwill of the officials, on whose favour I was of course in a great measure dependent for a rapid turnaround. Wilmington was already sadly pinched and war-torn. There never was too much to eat and drink there, and the commonest luxuries were almost things of the past. So when it became known that there was practically open house on board the Banshee, friends flocked to her. She soon attained great popularity, and it was really a sight when our luncheon bell rang to see guests, invited and uninvited, turn up from all quarters. We made them all welcome, and when our little cabin was filled we generally had an overflow meeting on deck. What a pleasure it was to see them eat and drink! Men who had been accustomed to live on cornbread and bacon, and to drink nothing but water, appreciated our delicacies, our bottled beer, good brandy, and on occasions our champagne, warmed their hearts toward us. The chief steward used to look at me appealingly as a hint that our stores would never last out. In fact, we were often on very short commons before we got back to Nassau. But we had our reward. If any special favour were asked, it was always granted, if possible, to the Banshee, and if any push had to be made there was always someone to make it. Whether due to the luncheon parties or not need not be said, but we were within a very few days able to cast off our moorings and drop down the river ballasted with tobacco and laden with cotton, 3 tiers even on deck. Such things are almost incredible nowadays. The reckless loading to which high profits and the perquisites allowed to officers led is to a landsman inconceivable. That men should be found willing to put to sea in all these frail craft piled like hay wagons it is extraordinary enough, but that they should do so in the face of a vigilant and active blockading force, and do it successfully, seems rather an invention of romance than a commonplace occurrence of our own time. True, running out was a much easier matter than running in, for the risks inseparable from making a port, so difficult to find as Wilmington, without lights and with constant change of courses, were absent, and as soon as the bar was crossed, navigation at least gave no anxiety. Steele and I had hit on a plan for getting out that promised almost a certainty of success. Its security lay in its impudence, a cardinal virtue of blockade running, which, as will be seen later on in some of the more critical scenes, approached the sublime. The idea was perhaps obvious enough. As has been said, the flagship during the night remained at anchor, while the other ships moved slowly to and fro upon the inner line, leaving, as was natural enough, a small area around the admiral's ship unpatrolled. This was enough for us. Bringing up the Banshee behind Fort Fisher, where she could lie hidden from the blockaders till nightfall, we rowed ashore to get from Colonel Lamb the last news of the squadron's movements and to ascertain which ship bore the admiral's flag. She proved to be the Minnesota, a large 60-gun frigate. Her bearings were accurately taken, and as soon as night fell the Banshee stole quietly from her concealment, slipped over the bar, dark as it was, and by the aid of Steele's observations ran in perfect security close by the flagship and out to sea well clear of the first cordon. In trying to pass the second, however, we were less successful, for we ran right across a gunboat. She saw us and at once opened fire. But slow as the Banshee was, luckily the northern gunboats for the most part were slower still, so we had no difficulty in increasing the distance between us till it was felt we were out of sight again. Our helm was then put hard over, giving us a course at right angles to the one we had been steaming, and after keeping it a few minutes we stopped. It was a manoeuvre nearly always successful, providing the helm was not put over too soon, and this time it achieved the usual result. As we lay perfectly still, watching the course of the gunboat by the flashes of her guns and by the rockets she was sending up to attract her consorts, we had the satisfaction of seeing her labouring furiously past us and firing wildly into black space. There still remained the danger at daybreak of the third cordon, and with anxious eyes the horizon was scoured as the darkness began to fail. A daylight chase with the Banshee in her present condition could not be thought of, but fortunately not a sign of a cruiser was to be seen. All that day, and the next, we steamed onward with our hearts in our mouths, turning our stern to every sail or patch of smoke that was seen, till on the evening of the third day we steamed into Nassau as proudly as a heavy list to starboard would allow. So ended my first attempt, a triumphant success. Beside the inward freight of £50 a ton on the war material, I had earned by the tobacco ballast alone £7,000, the freight for which had been paid at the rate of £70 a ton. But this was a flea bite compared to the profit of the 500-odd bales of cotton we had on board, which was at least £50 per bale. No wonder I took kindly to my new calling, and no wonder I at once set to work to get the Banshee reloaded for another run before the moonless nights were over. End of chapter 5.